Welcome to Let's Play Rule the Waves 3 as Germany, starting in 1935. It's June 1948, and we've just finished a major war against Britain and France. And in the previous episode, 61, we looked at how we might rebuild the fleet for the early missile era. And the reception was fantastic. Thank you so much. I learnt so much. And so in this episode, we're going to completely revise that 1955 fleet plan and also share with you the bits and bobs that so many of you have taught me from the brilliant reception for that episode. Over 2,100 views, nearly 200 comments. Been brilliant. Thanks, guys. It was so much fun to do and so much fun to read through. So let's push on and see what we've learned, or I've learned. So these are a bit random, but bear with me. So steam catapults, which come in 52, will drop the penalty for having a heavy jet and jet attack planes from currently 36,000 down to 30,000. So if you have a 30,000 or more carrier and steam catapults, you won't face this penalty where a jet fighter, heavy jet fighter, costs 1.5 times what it should normally do. Speaking of this penalty, in the manual it says it's at 40,000, but actually in some of the releases since then, that's been brought down to 36,000, which is why that's 36,000. I mused in the previous episode whether I should stop doing damage control, and there's two real schools of thought here. So one school of thought is missiles are going to be predominantly fire-based damage, superstructure damage, and so damage control is still a really important part of keeping your ships survivable. The other is a more kind of total cost thing and suggests that the cost per month multiplied by 12 months multiplied by, say, 10 years gives you a figure. I think it's something in the order of 180,000, and for that you could build or substantially build a new carrier. So even if it did protect one heavy ship from being sunk, you wouldn't necessarily be in a plus. So yeah, so I'm a bit about that. Also suggested that fire is really a problem for the big ships. For the small ships, the light cruisers and destroyers, it's still flotation, and that actually investing in torpedo protection is probably a better thing for them. There's general agreement that it's cheaper to keep your ships in maintenance, whether in reserve or mothball, than to scrap them and then build new. There's a probable exception to that, which is submarines, but I'll come to that a little bit later. So in general, I will be keeping ships unless they have fallen so far below the standard by which the rest of the fleet. So we're talking mainly speed here. So, if their fleet is charging around at 29 knots and you have a set of ships that only do 27, then you either need to downgrade them or to scrap them because they, just making the rest of the fleet slow. Missile storage, I didn't realize, costs money. If you have plentiful missiles, that will cost you something like 7.5% of your overall maintenance budget. Adequate is 5%. Scarce, whatever it's called, is probably 2.5%. Currently, I'm spending about 900 on missile. I do have it set to plentiful. I intend to keep it at plentiful. So that seems to be a bearable cost at the moment, but something to bear in mind. There's a strong push that guns still matter. Yes, we're transitioning into the early missile era, and they absolutely will have an impact. But actually, once that first volley of missiles is fired, and then maybe the reloads have fired, it's down to the guns. So don't be too quick in 1948 through to 1955 to completely get rid of your guns. There's still a lot of shooting in those guns. And the missile hit rate is only about 5%. There is an improved guidance tech around about 1955. I'm on considerable tech variation, so that could go either way, where it'll increase to about 10%. But then obviously that means that 95 or 90% of your missiles will miss. So yeah, you need a lot of missiles. Your battle cruisers will get their combat air patrol from carriers if the carrier is set to support the battle cruisers. So if you have your carriers in a separate force, then it's not going to provide cap. Obviously, you can request cap from land-based air, but then that depends on the land base to, be reasonably nearby. Obviously, this is why a lot of people build a cap CVL to set its support in order to directly support the battle cruisers, whilst the rest of the carrier force stay nicely away. I'm not thinking of building a CVL at the moment, but let me know in the comments if you think that's short-sighted. Next up, there was a lot of discussion about the utility of jet attack. They are expensive. They're about twice the cost of a torpedo bomber. But once you get them and use them, they are quite deadly. Until they arrive, your torpedo bombers still have value, firing either missiles and or torpedoes, not only for the whole, sinking of enemy ships, which is great, love that, but also because it disrupts your enemy ships' formations. They wheel off all over the place to avoid missiles and to avoid torpedoes. Then, should you get your gunships in range, they are a much less cohesive force. Jet attack is also deadly versus air bases. Now, this is something I've never done. Apparently, all you have to do when you go to your carrier screen where you're looking at which squadrons to make into a strike, and instead of saying set it to naval strike, you set it to ground strike. Careful not to use air-to-surface missiles. Bombs is fine. But if you have, particularly if you've got like one problematic enemy airbase nearby, then suppressing that will give a big boost to the rest of your force. Jet attack take proportionately fewer losses the more of them that you have. This is partly because surface-to-air missiles prioritize air-to-surface missiles and then the jet attack, but also simply because your enemy's air defensive have a sort of saturation level, and your losses will increase until you reach that saturation level, but after that, your losses proportionately will go down. Strong emphasis on always coordinating your strikes to avoid getting your planes butchered. Now, I coordinated strikes from a carrier, but I didn't coordinate strikes from an entire carrier division. This is because it takes a long time. It can take an extra hour or more to coordinate a full division strike. And obviously your intelligence by then may have substantially changed or degraded. So I've always tried to get some planes over quickly, but that was pretty unsuccessful in terms of very high losses amongst dive bombers and torpedo bombers. A suggestion that you avoid helicopter and float plane search priority, because they're simply so much slower. If you send jets out to do the reconnaissance, they will zoom across, find the enemy, and then report the enemy much more quickly than if you send out float planes or later helicopters. My shipyard is at 69,000, and I was suggesting I really needed to increase that, and it's pointed out that actually currently carriers are limited to 69,000, so that's quite a sweet size. Yeah, I could build a fast battleship or a battlecruiser up to 90,000, but I'm unlikely to do that. That would be a bit of a vanity project. I mean, honestly, if you want to build that fast battleship of your dreams, that's 90,000, knock yourself out. But certainly in my fleet plans, that's not something I'm going to go towards because, cost. Also some discussion around whether you should delay building ASW until you get the enhanced sonar tech around about 52. So on the one hand, it suggested that this substantially increases sonar ability amongst ASW ships. On the other hand, amongst the min-max community, there's a lot of discussion, or a lot of opinions, not much data, but a lot of opinions around ship-based ASW being very much less effective than particularly plane-based ASW and carrier and AV-based ASW, and that therefore it's a nice to have tech, but don't knock yourself out around it. And another really important one is that the damage that you'll cause from your missile hits, that's remember 5 to 10% of missiles, is very hard to predict. So you could totally sink a ship with one missile, or a ship could survive, 4 missiles, and it's very, very hard to know which way it's going to go. I talked about putting aluminum superstructures. Suggestion was really focus on weight-sensitive ships like cruisers and destroyers. For the bigger ships, this is less of a priority. They are in any house less prone to fire, and also don't bother with corvettes because they're just simply not going to be in that kind of battle. We talked about the Soviet Bastion concept, where they didn't have any carriers at all, and then you use the money for other things, particularly missile ships. Pointed out that for most other navies, that's not really a good idea because there's a lot of blockade strength in those carriers. And if you don't have them, you are much more likely to be blockaded, and of course, much less likely to cause blockade. Now, amongst the Soviet Union, who are going to be blockaded pretty much come what may, that's not really a concern. Here's something I don't do. So when you've got a new carrier building, you can create new carrier squadrons and put them onto unassigned or reserve or whatever it's called, and have them training up whilst your carrier build, so that you're not forced to wait for the carrier design and then the carrier build and then the carrier working up, and then when you get the carrier, giving them air units, and then they take like a year or something to get good as pilots. So create them beforehand. Another fascinating thing, I had no idea it was a thing, is that at certain crucial numbers, the weight of increasing your ammunition doubles. So if you've, say, got 12-inch or more, and you want to increase your ammunition per gun from, say, 75 to 80, that may cost, I don't know, 25. But then to go from 80 to 85, suddenly that doubles to costing 50. It's not a reason to necessarily cap your ammo at these particular levels, but it's just something to be aware of. Going beyond this will cost twice the amount as it was to build up to this. There's also a missile cruisers tech in around about 56, just outside of our area of interest, that will allow cruisers not to have armor, which obviously gets translated into more pointy things and more defensive things, if you wish. Next up, the design of your carrier wing. So you ideally want to have about 50% fighters, so like 25%, half of those on cap and half of those as escorts, 35% attack aircraft, and then of course your 1/6 special squadron for your electronic warfare, your airborne early warning, your air-sea rescue, and your anti-submarine. That should give you the ability to organize 2.5 strikes using heavy anti-surface missiles, coordinate those strikes across your divisions, make sure they've got full fighter escort. Ideally, you should be looking at the best quality pilots you could have, And of course, you need the support of your special squadron. What that actually means in terms of numbers is a suggestion of building a lovely carrier with 119. And then here you go, 2 squadrons of heavy fighters, 1 of light fighters, 2 of jet attack. Ideally, they're all night capable. I don't think any of my jets are night capable at the moment, plus your special squadron. It'll only cost you 3,766 every single month. Well, you know, if you want to play with the big boys, you have to have the big boy toys. And then finally, you don't need that 90,000 ton battle cruiser. Just an Alaska-style large cruiser would be enough as a cruiser killer if you wanted to do that. I think I've always quite liked the Alaskas, so yeah, that would be great if I can afford it, if I can fit it in. Some things to consider. Well, what if you scrapped your battlecruisers? Bearing in mind what was suggested, that this is still a gun era, but as soon as you get the jet attacks, that may become less and less true. What's the opportunity cost here? What you could do with the money that you were spending on maintaining and upgrading those battlecruisers? Pushback on my planning. I've used monthly build costs because I find that the easiest to work out, because that's what you've got to play with every month. But it's completely legitimate if you want to take a total build cost. I mean, I suppose technically that's total design and build cost, and work it out that way. So, right, between now and 1955, my pot is this big, and then this is going to cost this much and this much and this much. Harder to sort of plan it into a timeline, but very much, you know, an interesting way of thinking about stuff. And also you could think about lifetime ownership costs. So that's the design, the build, the maintenance for 20 years, chuck in, you know, 2 or 3 refits as well, give some estimated cost for that. And that will give you the total cost and allow you to plan. You remember from the previous episode, that pie chart will allow you to plan in how much of your fleet was going to do what. Another thing is around anti-aircraft air defense. It only brings down about 10% of enemy fighters. Now, there's been in the forum some pushback on this because, you know, certainly in the later part of World War II, the US Navy experience was they were bringing down about 30%. That was probably a bit generous because the Japanese and their kamikaze tactics were actually driving planes far more forward than normal sensible people would do. So that's probably a bit high. And the experience of, say, the Royal Navy in the Mediterranean or in the Arctic may well have been different. But, you know, it is modest compared to the huge contribution that CAP provides. However, it does have an important feature of breaking up air attacks towards the end and effectively making planes miss. So it's like a soft kill rather than a hard kill. Another thing just to focus on, and I know I mentioned this last time, is you can't monkey around with crew quality anymore. You know, a ship that goes into mothballs is a useless ship unless you bring it out from mothballs or indeed from reserve with plenty of time to build up that crew quality. And that, you know, that if you go down to poor, that's going to take 12 months or so to bring it up. You can accelerate it by using exercises. They are comparatively expensive, but they certainly will give most ships a lift in crew quality. I mentioned air defense, so I thought it was interesting to just go into that a little bit more. There's this table which gives what type of attack is impacted by what kind of air defense and what sorts of things impact it. So if we go from the bottom up, torpedo and dive bombing, light air defense is very effective, depending on aircraft speed. Unguided rockets, medium air defense, level bombing, I don't know why it has nothing here. I don't know if that means nothing affects it or everything affects it. So a little unclear. This is from the manual. And then in your air-to-surface missiles, heavy, medium, and light are effective, modified by radar and EW, and by the level of missile technology, missile guidance technology, and that kind of stuff. As I said, you get about 10% of your air losses from guns. Heavy air defense and directors cause the most losses amongst your AA against propellers, right? This is for the propeller age. And also provide a level of cover for nearby ships. Medium air defense en masse will protect the ship they're firing from, as will light air defense. And light air defense tends to break up the air attack in the last moment. So in the pre-jet propeller age, having a mass of anti-aircraft barrels is the key factor. Now, that changes in the jet age. We don't know, or I don't know, the percentage of air losses from AA guns and or from surface-to-air missiles. I believe surface-to-air missiles are quite highly effective. The only anti-aircraft guns that really matter are your radar-directed medium AA. And these are good against jets, and also against some of the missiles. You need at least 4. You can have up to 8, although it gives you diminishing returns. And then beyond 8, it becomes redundant. Likewise, your light AA guns can be replaced by close-in weapon systems when they become available, which is a bit later. And they're quite good at missile defense. And again, 4 is fine, 6 is max, beyond 6 is irrelevant. Which means that heavy AA guns and their directors become obsolete, and they're just not worth having. And indeed, light AA guns are probably obsolescent, if not obsolete, at this point. And you really want a layered set of surface-to-air missiles if you possibly can, and all the techs that will help with precision are to be gained as far as you can. So that's that switch between propeller-driven aircraft and jet aircraft. Quite a different air defense setup. Subs next. So I'm still swithering on the subs. I've come up with 3 plans, and they're all good for different enemies. So plan number 1, is just keep half. So scrap the oldest 47 submarines and scrap all the new construction. Bit painful. It will save us 2,200 a month plus 13,000 every month on new construction. Actually, that's not true. It will serve us 13,000 in total, because a lot of those submarines are nearly complete. So as I think it gets out in about 5 months, you're saving less and less. But in total, it'll save you 13,000. You'll be left with 58 submarines that will cost 1,500 a month, with a mixture of SSs and coastal submarines. This gives us the highest number and is very viable if Britain is going to become the enemy soon, which I don't think so, but you know. Plan B is, instead of keeping half, keeping the best. So keeping all the 122% reliability subs. That includes finishing up the new construction. So we've got new construction at 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 months away. And then scrapping the rest, scrapping anything that's less than 122%. That will give us a comparable saving, so 2,440, so similar to keeping half. It'll only give us 33%, so it'll only give us 33 subs against 58. They'll all be medium submarines. And this seemed to be a viable strategy against France and Italy, if you think they're going to be next up. And then finally, plan C is keep none whatsoever. Scrap the lot and wait until you get improved submarine electronics. and censored tech in around about 1952, and wait until guided missile submarines, SSGs, arrived in around about 56. This will save us 3,760 a month. So, fair beast of money. It'll also save us that 13,000 and a bit from scrapping all the new construction. So we would certainly have no new construction for at least 5 years, and we would have no submarines in effect. This is viable if you're going to have a war against the Soviet Union, because submarines don't really matter against the Soviet Union, or if there's not going to be a war until 1958, actually, I think I calculated. So 10 years' time. 10-year rules, they always work pretty well. So that's quite an appealing strategy to release a lot of money for new construction in the expectation that we're not going to be going up against Britain, France, or Italy. Soviet Union, I mean, they go to war at the drop of a hat, but I'm really not bothered with them. So those are my 3 submarine plans. I'll put a vote in the community tab to see which ones you favour. A lot of discussion around the various escort classes I proposed last time. So I proposed a kind of destroyer escort, which turns out to be effectively a hidden type of destroyer of DD, which I'll go into in a moment, versus various corvettes, either on trade protection and on active fleet. And I've settled really on the destroyer escort as my universal escort ship. So it has these kinds of characteristics. So it's 1,000 tons, spacious accommodation. It needs to be 21 knots or more. Just give it the cheapest engines you can. Medium range. It doesn't really need any fancy pants radar. Radar limit 2. Radar 2 is fine. I've got it down to this 176 a month, or a total cost of 2,100. And I've done that because I've maxed out the number of ASW it can have, including torpedoes, maxed out the number of mines it has, possibly, or indeed even probably, including mine-sweeping gear. So there is an argument saying, well, you build half of these as ASW, and you build half of these as mine countermeasures, and then you set them on the 2 separate tasks. Or you could just have them as a universal ship. Yeah, it halves the ASW and it halves the mine countermeasures abilities, but then you've got double the number of ships anyhow. What it doesn't have is any guns or fire control or anti-aircraft guns. It doesn't have a helicopter because apparently they cost too much, although we haven't discovered helicopters anyhow. You give it the lowest radar. You may have space for enhanced sonar later on if that's going to make a difference. And they can be used in either the active fleet or the trade protection. So here's what that looks like in terms of classic fleet destroyers against these destroyer escorts versus corvettes. So fleet destroyer, big beast, very expensive, full of weapons, part of your active fleet. It will contribute its whatever ASW can fit on it to the fleet's defense against submarines, because that's done on an area basis. It won't contribute anything to the global trade ASW value. It won't contribute to minesweeping because you probably won't put minesweeping gear on it. I mean, you could do, but most people want to put more pointy stick things on them. And they do appear in battles when the battle generator creates one. You then have these 2 flavors of escort destroyer, or actually 1 flavor of escort destroyer on 2 rolls. So if you put your escort destroyer on the active fleet, it won't appear in battle except under these conditions. So it'll only appear in coastal areas if the battle happens to be in that area and it's like a little independent tootling around. It might get messed up or not. It might appear in a battle from the battle generator if you're outside a home area and there's no other ships to put in. It might appear in a battle if you don't have enough fleet destroyers to protect the fleet, in which case we probably need to have a word about your provisioning of fleet destroyers. And it might appear in a battle escorting a convoy as part of a convoy defense battle. But none of those, except for C, they're actually part of the fleet. They just happen to be around. So you can put them in the active fleet in, say, your home area. They will contribute to minesweeping. They will contribute to the area's ASW to help protect your big ships. Obviously, they're not going to contribute to the global ASW. Alternatively, you can take the same ship and put it on trade protection. Then it doesn't impact the fleet area ASW value, but does the trade global ASW value. And it also impacts the area minesweeping. Now, compared to that, an ASW corvette, similar to your escort destroyer, you could have it having minesweeping, but probably not. I've found that corvettes actually cost a little bit more than this destroyer escort, in part because destroyer escorts don't need a gun, whereas corvettes do. Destroyer escorts do need torpedoes, which will become ASW torpedoes, whereas corvettes can't have torpedoes. We talked about this ASW corvette that might be on the active fleet so that it didn't appear in battles, but that's been replaced by these escort destroyers, which aren't going to appear in battles anyhow. We talked about corvette mine countermeasures, but the escort destroyer can pretty much do all of that. And then finally, it's just worth noting that your air ASW, principally your patrol aircraft, will contribute to your fleet ASW and to your global trade protection, and will appear in battles and loose off missiles and what have you. So in terms of the numbers of ASW, air ASW is fantastic value for money. So here's what my destroyer escort looks like, both as an ASW and as a mine countermeasures ship. So displaces 1,000 tons, speed the minimum 21. Now, that's a sort of game artifact. I'm actually absolutely fine to say, well, you know, probably should be like 28 or something. I've not seen speed be a factor, but anyhow, it's got oil and turbines. Got oil and turbines here simply because that was the cheapest option. Diesels worked well as well, but were a tiny bit more expensive. Obviously, no protection, spacious accommodation, torpedoes for ASW torpedoes, mines and mine sweeping to have the biggest possible impact on the mine warfare, and then as many ASW things as I can. Obviously, that would be 12, but it's half to 6. And rubbish radar. And here it is coming in at 176 a month, or a total cost of 2,100. So here is the equivalent that I can manage for a Corvette. So exactly the same, 1,000 tons, 21 knots, no protections, spacious. It has to have a gun. I could bring that down to a 2-inch gun. No fire control, no anti-air, no other secondary guns, and no torpedoes because it's not allowed. Maximum mines and minesweeping, maximum ASW. It's a tiny bit cheaper, so it's 147 against 176. So it's 1,900 against 2,100. But the ASW value is 5. for reasons. Whereas it's only at 10 here, whereas on the destroyer it was 12 down to 6. So, I mean, you pay your money, take your choice. Let's just check the legality of it. So, yeah, no fire control, not the best type, ammunition low, could have better radar, but legal. If I turn this into a destroyer, I can clear that. Turret. And I want a couple of torpedoes. Let's give it R. Okay, and the torpedoes is what pushes it up to 12, half by the minesweeping. And here you are. Let me just check. That's all good. No fire control, bit of radar. But yeah, it's perfectly happy with that. So in fact, I've shaved a tiny bit off. I don't think that matters. Yep, that's all good. Now, if I went to 1100, it says, no, I'm sorry, I have no idea what that ship is. If I went down to 900, it would be fine. So destroyer escort, or what in other navies would be called torpedo boats, are absolutely fine. I use 1,000 because that's best for the minesweeping value. And yeah, these will be very helpful in a huge variety of conditions and make the best kind of balance between mine countermeasures and ASW and nothing else. So that's that, with a tiny bit of saving somehow. I'm not quite sure how. So that's my new Universal Escort. Here is my old timeline. So a couple of heavy cruisers, 4 light cruisers, the battle cruisers in the early 50s upgraded, 3 new carriers started, fleet destroyers built throughout, mine countermeasures and ASW built mainly at the beginning, and then a crash course of ASW for trade protection towards the end, as well as a crash course on medium submarines towards the end, plus some money to bring up the Air Force from the reduced state that I'm going to send it to, plus some money for bringing things that have been in reserve into the active fleet, plus things like exercises and the like. And a roughly consistent level of funding, 20,000 at the beginning, 21,000 at the end, around about 17,000 in the middle. My new timeline is looking like this. So obviously the carriers would love a 4th carrier. If I get, very wealthy or something, that's definitely on the cards. The battle cruisers upgraded at some point, particularly when SAMs become available. I'd love an Alaska style battle cruiser or large cruiser, whatever you want to call it. I've dropped the heavy cruisers and just gone for 6 light cruisers. These are very gunny. By the time sort of 55, 56 comes along, I'm sure I will be building new, much more missile-dominated light cruisers, particularly when missile cruisers become a thing, and these will need refitting to be much more missile-y, but this is where we are now. Constant program of fleet destroyers as before, a late program of submarines, depending kind of on who the enemy is. This new set of universal escorts, these destroyer escorts, being built throughout. Again, some stuff to expand the Air Force towards the end and to exercise and take things out of reserve and mothballs. I'd forgotten that I need to upgrade 2 of my existing carriers to be jets, make them spacious accommodation, and add angled flight decks. So this will be happening when angled flight decks become a thing. Same really with the big carriers. And then I have the other two that are already jet converted, and they'll get an angled flight deck. So their upgrade will be a little bit shorter and simpler. That has evened it out to around about 18, 19 throughout, with a little bit of a peak in 1950. Actually, a little bit of peak towards the end. So slightly more even. And so this is kind of my guide as to how much money. Now, as with my previous plan, I haven't factored in increases in budget as tensions increase. So this is, if you like, a defensive budget. I should be able to afford all of this and have a little bit of wiggle room and extra money to play with when the new stuff becomes available. Oh, and I'd forgotten, although I'm not building any new heavy cruisers, I still do have 3 heavy cruisers, and they will need to be upgraded at some point. So that needs to be factored in. So here's the difference between the old episode 61 fleet and the new revised episode 62 fleet. So battlecruisers the same, CVs the same, but I've now factored in upgrading them. Heavy cruisers reduced by 2, not having these 2 new ones, but I have factored in modernizing them. 1 is being modernized as we speak. Light cruisers increased from 8 up to 10. Fleet destroyers staying the same at 46. And then the number of different types of escorts simplified into 1 escort class. And instead of all of these, 46 of them, I'm going to build 56 of them. And that should fill a nice tidy slot. There may also be some existing corvettes and destroyers that I upgrade, but they should be really low-cost kind of things. That's it. So next episode, we will get on and we will start building this fleet and shaping everything, unless, of course, you come up with some interesting observations that make me completely change my mind. But I think this is a pretty secure thing now. These 2 episodes, they've been absolutely fantastic, really fascinating. Thank you so much for the rich amount of effort and guidance and advice that you've injected into the discussion. Just bear in mind, I guess finally, there are 2 styles of playing Rule the Waves. There's the Rule the Waves is a game, and I want to min-max the game style, which I respect. I love the detail, the nerdy detail that people go into. And then there's the Rule the Waves is a naval simulator, and I want to role play the simulator. And although I'm not immune to some of the min-max stuff, I do lean towards the role play simulator side of the game. And, you know, either style is great, whichever you enjoy the most. So thanks very much for watching this. I'm off to lie on a sun lounger for a couple of months? Oh, I wish. A couple of weeks. So I will see you back either at the very end of September or early October. Thanks very much for watching, and see you next time.